Everybody, this is Hannah Legree. I'm running for 3rd District Council in Lexington, Kentucky. That's Lexington's Urban County Council. And I have a Tuesday evening session, and that's what you're tuned into. So every Tuesday evening, I talk to a community member about issues that are important to the 3rd District and to our community at large. And we're speaking during a pandemic, so we're going to talk about issues related to the pandemic, but what we're discussing today goes far beyond our current moment. And I want to thank our guest, Mary Arthur, for being here today to join me to talk about a couple of different tree-related organizations and initiatives. We're going to be discussing the urban canopy, ways for you to get involved, how you can learn more about trees, and why trees matter, especially now. Thank you so much, Mary, for being here.
Of course.
And I'll give you a moment to introduce yourself, and then we'll move into our conversation.
Okay. First of all, I should start by saying that everything I say today is just my own opinion, and I don't mean to suggest that any of the organizations I'm involved with hold the same opinion. So these are my own opinions. But I am a forest ecologist. I work at UK, and I'm involved in several different tree-related things that we'll be talking more about.
Great, thank you. So Mary, I'm going to talk to you about something we were just discussing in passing right before we went on. I was raised in Mason County, Kentucky, on a large farm. My dad's a conservationist, my mother's an artist, and they both love trees. So I spent a lot of time identifying trees, walking through the woods, planting trees. That was a big part of our family work that we did together and ways that we connected with one another. And those are really, really strong memories for me that shaped how I think about our responsibility and relationship to the natural world. I'm interested now, because this is a big part of the work that you do now. What's the origin of your interest in trees? And then specifically, we're talking about urban trees, but what about for you just from the beginning?
Yeah, so I would say that I didn't really know I had a tree origin story until kind of recently. Instead, I would have said that I had I grew up in suburban Denver, and I was always kind of a strong environmentalist, and my family went camping. So I felt like I had a relationship to the out of doors. But I've recently remembered that I had a really strong relationship with a particular tree. It was a sugar maple tree in the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the middle of 5 kids surrounded by brothers on both sides. And this tree, which had this nice horizontal low-hanging branch that I could shinny up to and then climb high in the tree, I think kind of provided me with a way of getting away from the fray and seeing the world around me. But what's interesting about that is that I had forgotten about that tree for decades. And then in 2014, I was a co-lead on a living learning community at UK called The Greenhouse, which was for first-year students interested in the environment. And I led this segment called Urban Food and Forests. And in that, I had an assignment for the students to identify a favorite tree on campus. And then I got these assignments back, identify the favorite tree and then talk about why it was a favorite tree. Mm-hmm. And the stories that came back were so heart-opening, mind-opening. It just told me so much about this thing I hadn't understood, which is that if you ask people about their relationship to nature or their relationship to trees, you'll unleash this whole box of memories. And in asking those students about that in this favorite tree assignment, I remembered my favorite tree, and I had forgotten about it, since I was probably 12 years old. Yeah.
Even you talking about that, immediately I started thinking also, what was it about my favorite tree that I loved, and what was the feeling of being in that tree or connected to it? I remember I had a magnolia tree I just loved so much. It was the best climbing tree. Mm-hmm. You go so high and feel safe, even if you're far above the ground and you can spy out over the yard or the neighborhood, and that feels special. And I remember hiding in that tree. There's a photographer who came, I don't remember why they were there, but from the newspaper. And I remember thinking, oh, I hope they get a picture of the tree and that I'm hiding in it. And they never find out. So there's something about being able to spy and feel enmeshed and safe. And
Wow.
something I've noticed, looking at a lot of people, the way they're posting online and talking about our current moment, is that there seems to be a renewed interest in nature and in trees. So many people are taking pictures of trees and talking about them. And I've even heard people say, gosh, this feels like the first season that I've noticed that there's a tree in my front yard, and it has a smell, right? That there are flowers and they have a smell. And now I imagine that people are also thinking, well, what if I want to plant more trees in the third district, in our city, or even just around our county? How can they begin? How can they begin learning about trees and learning about planting them and doing it right in a way that makes sense for their landscape?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, there are lots of different ways to approach that, but I kind of want to start by saying we focus a lot on planting trees, and there's this sort of go-to. I want to plant a tree. You plant a tree now for generations later. But I kind of want to start by saying that first and foremost, we need to protect the big trees. It's the big trees that really provide so much of the tree canopy, environmental benefits that come from trees. So I would say, look first to see if you have trees and to see what you're doing to protect those trees. Maybe put some mulch around it. Even the really big trees that have been there for 60 or 80 or 100 trees, they still need care. And they're the most important trees we have. And from there, I would say, well, if you want to plant a tree, you really have to think about planting a tree in a spot where it can live a really long time. Like you want to plant a tree for the future. We're not going to, people say, well, let's work on climate change and plant a tree. But a little tree doesn't absorb very much carbon, and it takes a long time for it to serve any of those environmental benefits. And so we really need to think carefully about how to plant trees so that they'll live a long time. And I would say, while you're thinking about trees and planting trees and green infrastructure, you should think about getting rid of your lawn. And we recently did this. We're kind of experimenting in our front lawn, which is we put a bunch of cardboard down and covered it with wood chips, and we're going to turn it into something that's not grass, because grass is actually, it's a monoculture, and it leads to all sorts of problems with the soil. It's not a great crop. But I also just want to mention that one of the key kind of go-to organizations that's cropped up in Lexington pretty recently is Trees Lexington. And this is the organization that Jake Gibbs formed, and its entire focus is on figuring out how to get more trees into private places. It turns out that that's something like around 85% of the land inside the service boundary is privately owned. And so we really need to be thinking about how to talk to private landowners. And those could be churches, but they could also be people in neighborhoods and, local yards and things like that. And so thinking about how to get trees into private land is really a key thing. And they spearheaded this lovely, amazing, beautiful, creative project called the Pocket Nurseries. And a pocket nursery is essentially a very, somewhat manageable, will be more manageable next time around probably, bed of 6 trees that are little, and it's kind of like a fostering thing where you foster those trees and you commit to getting them planted out. And so for anybody who's interested in being part of that program, I can't say for sure because I'm not on the board, but I would be surprised if they won't do it again. They're always trying to tap at ways to get more trees out in neighborhoods. And so they're kind of a go-to organization. So those are just some beginning things to think about.
Wonderful. And I want to encourage people who are tuned in to add in their questions, as always, or if they have resources that they want to share, please add those in, because this will be available to people who are curious about trees after the fact. We want to make sure that if you have resources and you're tuned in, that you share them with the group, because that means that we're all richer for it. And I have a follow-up question about the pocket nursery, and I want to try to envision this. So if you have a pocket nursery, for example, someone was interested in getting involved, would they need a yard space where they would nurture the trees and foster them for a period of time to get them stable?
Yep. Yeah, and so they're not big, but they need to grow up so they have a good enough root system so that in the fall they get planted out to these other spots. And it's a way of expanding the network of people who are then responsible for figuring out 6 people to adopt a tree. So they're fostering them and then they need to get them out for adoption. You can adopt them yourself, but it's better if you have other people adopt them. So I think there's so many things about that project that's just brilliant and beautiful, not the least of which is the way that it connects us to each other in this community-wide way.
Yeah, and builds relationships around growing and planting trees.
Mm-hmm.
Having to connect your tree to its future home, I think, is a very positive thing. And
Pretty wild.
And that, and that leads us to my next question, Mary, and it's something that we have talked about on this conversational series, and it's the idea of being interconnected, right? And thinking about the work that you're doing with trees, what way does this work connect to the pandemic that's happening right now, or why is this work important now?
Yeah, well, let me back up and say that a term people use a lot for this work that we do is to call it urban and community forestry. And I think that term is really important because urban trees are at least as much about the people and the communities and the way people interact with those trees and nurture those trees as it is about the arboricultural aspects of those trees, how we treat them, how we grow them, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so really you can't have a viable urban tree canopy if it's not connected to the humans that live there and if you're not building on those community components. And so, a lot of what we do with the Urban Forest Initiative, which we lovingly refer to as UFI, is really try to connect knowledge and understanding and really mostly relationships to trees to the people in our community. But I think your question was, how does this relate? Why is it important now? How does it relate to the pandemic? And I would say, well, probably, in some kind of really direct ways, which is that we know that people live in communities where there are elements of inequality that are baked in. And they're baked in by virtue of the fact that lot sizes aren't the same, and the history of tree planting isn't the same, and proximity to highways isn't the same. So there's lots of ways in which there are environmental justice issues. And those environmental justice issues include a lack of green infrastructure. And so, in a parallel way, some of the communities that are being more impacted by COVID are communities that have lower health access, but also have lower health outcomes or problematic health outcomes, some of which could be ameliorated by improved green infrastructure. And so, so I think it's important to be thinking about what those linkages might be and to be really laser focused on how to address the social inequities in our green infrastructure that have been that will be continuing to be revealed to us through all of these kinds of challenging things. Another thing that I would say about the urban tree canopy is, as you said, Hannah, there are people who are going out inside and saying, well, I had never really noticed that tree or what it smells like or its canopy before the leaves come on. Mm-hmm. And so I really see our urban tree canopy serving this important kind of spiritual and emotional support. When we go out walking in our neighborhood, we see a lot more people than we normally saw. I don't know what they were doing before. They were driving in their cars, and I guess we were too. Now they're out and they're looking and they're appreciating and they're breathing in the fresh air, and there's this piece of kind of nature renewal that's happening. And I've found myself saying to people a lot that I'm really glad that the pandemic caught up to us as spring was coming on, because I find so much solace in the trees greening up, flowering and then greening up, and all of that I think is really, really helpful and meaningful. I think the other sort of connection to the pandemic is that there's some really good emerging evidence that part of the reason that that we're in this pandemic is because of the jump of this virus from other mammals to humans. And one of the things that really accelerates and makes more feasible the jump, these zoonotic diseases to go from animals to humans, is the way that we've treated the environment. And so the degradation of ecosystems, our proximity to those animals that before might have been more wild, but are now captured and made, brought into close proximity with human beings. And so it's really only a matter of time before, and we've seen there are other examples of them in the last decade or two, but I think we can trace some of that back to the way that we treat our ecosystems. And I often think of urban forestry as being kind of a gateway, a gateway, a gateway to, understanding and relating to urban nature. I see as kind of a gateway to understanding and appreciate wilder nature. And so I think there are lots and lots of reasons that urban nature is really important, and it's especially important now.
It is, yes. I agree with you, Marian. And I think that there are people who want to get involved and who are thinking, how can I help the local ecosystem, what I have access to? We're talking about all the benefits of shade. We're talking about the social and emotional benefits of the natural world in a city like ours, especially. And there are people who likely will say, well, I'm not an expert on trees. I've never planted a garden. I didn't grow up knowing how to interact with plants. I know that there are ways for people to get involved no matter what their level of expertise or background. And an initiative that I was paying attention to is Tree Week. And so if people are thinking, okay, I have this renewed interest. I care about climate change. I care about the environment. I want to be a good steward, if nothing else. Should they start at Tree Week? Where do you think they should start?
That's a great question. I think, okay, so let's say what Tree Week is.
Yes.
A couple of years ago, we had this brainstorm idea to have this thing called Tree Week, and it would be a week-long series of events of all different sorts that could connect to trees, even in the most sort of slim ways, that would give people lots of different avenues for thinking about trees. And so we have had a ton of library programs, for example, around trees and educating kids about trees and having books about trees. The Fayette County Public Schools has been a huge partner for UFI all along the way, mostly through Tristine Loxton and Sue Marshall. And so they spearheaded with the support from Heather Wilson in urban forestry in LFUCG, and just from all of the different elements of the Urban Forest Initiative Working Group coming together and making tree plantings. And so, but we also had yoga, yoga or...
I remember there's like an embroidery project.
Yes, yep, dance, poetry, painting. I mean, there are so many different ways. And so the way it works is that they just find us on our website. And I don't remember what our website is, but you'll give it to them at the end, maybe. And so Tree Week is on the UFI website, and there will be an opportunity coming up for people to say, hey, I want to run an event, let me register my event. And it's by registering your event that the community will find out about it. We'll put it on a map, and people can find it on the map and go to it. They'll be all over the city. Last year, we even had some that were not in the city. And so it's kind of a growing way that people can honor their desire to be connected and engaged with trees. So I think Tree Week's a great place to start. I would also say that UFI sponsors typically three public seminars every year, every year. These are open to the public, and last year we had Florence Williams, who's the author of a book called The Nature Fix, which is all about how much we need nature in our lives. And before every one of these events, we have a tabling event, a social event. We provide food, and we invite community groups to come and share what they're doing. And so it's a way to have avenues, Seed Leaf's been to those, and the Horticulture Club at UK, and a bazillion others that I can't think of at the moment. Flora Cliff, and tons of different organizations come and talk about what they do. And so there would be lots of ways to tap into that to see, oh, here's an organization that's doing something I might be interested in. How could I join, or how could I volunteer? How could I be more involved? So I think that UFI seminars would be another really great way for people to chime in.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I think what's nice is that people who are interested, they can learn in many different ways, right? And
Absolutely.
you can join and take in information. You can decide, I want a pocket nursery. There are many different ways to engage depending on your level of comfort or just your background or what's right for you at the time. Yeah, so.
That's exactly right. And I think there's lots of sources of information, and lots of people eager and ready to point people to that information. Trees Lexington's a great place to start. Coming to a Newfie seminar would be a great place to start, because there'd be a ton of people there that you could just sidle up to and ask them, hey, how'd you figure out how to do this part?
Yes, great, good. So now if people are feeling engaged and interested in trees, they have some next steps. And we talked a little bit about educational initiatives. You mentioned those with children, and I'm thinking about lessons in another way. And I want to circle back to this pandemic conversation, because it's something we talked about. What lessons, if any, would you want to add in terms of thinking about how this experience with the pandemic can help to strengthen our city's resilience to the climate crisis and perhaps in general? And maybe you've already said some of your thoughts about that, but I want to make sure there's space for that response.
Yeah, so I think that I think that we're very lucky right now to live in Kentucky. And the reason is because we have, local elected officials who are really doing a good job of using fact-based information to guide the way that they're asking us to function as a community of people. I see a renewed focus on service. So people are really stepping up and saying, how can I help? How can I be part of this community? How can I be connected to people? How can I be connected to people even though I'm kind of stuck in my house? Mm-hmm. And so kind of a renewed focus on service and sacrifice for the common good. So saying, gee, I see people who are less comfortable than I am during this time, maybe who've lost their jobs or for whom staying at home is either not an option or not very comfortable. And who don't have access to food. So all of this building of this kind of more resilient network across people within our community, I think is, I hope is something that we will learn and then we'll retain and assimilate that lesson. I think scientific literacy is also something that we've really seen. I was thinking the other day about how quickly our vocabulary mastered all these new, for each of us, we mastered all these new vocabulary words that we use quite easily, and we're tracking the news and understanding what it means. We all know what it means to flatten the curve, and we're all on board for trying to figure out how to do that. So I think that there are some parallels there with building resilient communities that have resilient tree canopies, and that looks like recognizing that not all neighborhoods are created the same, and really trying to focus in on those neighborhoods and areas that could benefit from having a pocket nursery, and from sort of how do we build connections across neighborhoods, I think is one of the questions. And maybe in this time of pandemic we've learned to do that because we've created these online resources for connecting to people that we don't know, and sharing resources across those, and maybe losing some of the barriers to communication with people that aren't part of our social networks, maybe building new social networks. Mm-hmm. And so I think anytime that we can think about ways to break down the normal barriers to communication, and talk to people that we don't know, and talk to people who live in different places than us, and talk to people whose fears and concerns are different than ours, I think there are parallels there for how we're reacting in the face of a pandemic, and how we could be doing a better job of building a more resilient urban tree canopy. I guess I think that one of the things we've really tried to do with UFI, and never as successfully as we would like, is trying to brainstorm and create avenues for linking up the understanding and knowledge that we have to others who might not even know to ask those questions. Like, how do we do that? I think that's a really challenging question.
Mhm.
And I don't think I have any answers to how to do it. I just continue to, I and everybody that works together in this whole sphere of urban and community forestry, we're always asking this question about how can we work across boundaries or barriers or differences to create a more equitable green infrastructure that supports the health and well-being of people everywhere in our city and across cities. And actually, I think this would be a great time to point out the Green Heart Project in Louisville. So maybe many of our listeners have heard of the Green Heart Project, but it's a huge multi-million-dollar medical and tree planting project that's planting trees in some of the most polluted parts of Louisville, and then planting those trees, measuring the air pollution abatement that occurs as a result of those plantings, and then measures the heart health of the people who live in those neighborhoods. And so it's a very intensive study, but one that's really going to put data on what we think we know about the importance of a green infrastructure for human health. And so I think I would point people to just look up Green Heart Project, and you'll pull it up instantly on the website. It's got a lot of involvement from the Nature Conservancy. They're helping to get a lot of the trees out there. And so I think that's going to be, Louisville has a really significant heat island. So the city itself is really hot, and trees can mitigate that. So that'll be a project to really keep our eye on. And then I also wanted to remember to mention that in Lexington, the city commissioned an urban tree canopy report in 2013, and it was published in 2015, and you can find it on the Lexington, the LexingtonKY.gov website if you type in urban-forestry. And it has a ton of information about our urban tree canopy, what our urban tree canopy does for us, how much money it saves us in stormwater mitigation, heating costs, or cooling costs, I should say, carbon sequestration. I mean, there's so many things that it does for us. But then maybe one of the most important things that they provided us in this assessment is something called the Tree Canopy Report Card. And the Tree Canopy Report Card divides our city into council districts. And with each one of those council districts, it gives the tree canopy a grade, and it's based on 6 or 7 different attributes. And so I think it's a really useful tool it's quite readable. I think you don't have to be an expert to be able to read it, and it sits right on their website, right on the city's website. They're asking us to read it. And I think it provides a really good tool for then communicating to our council people about what we think we'd like to see in terms of our own urban tree canopy. So I would urge people to go look at that resource.
And we'll make sure to share that. I love the points that you brought up, Mary, about overall health and how we have a responsibility to one another, not just now, but in the future, to figure out how do we make our city healthier, and how do we use trees as part of that process, and that some of these inequities that we're seeing play out in healthcare systems and in other parts of our communities, they're not just limited to what we're seeing right now, and that our urban canopy is a part of a space for a solution. And also thinking about, as you were speaking, I was considering this idea of mutual aid. You're talking about all these ways that people have come together to help support one another, and these new bridges and networks that have been built. I think we're frozen. Are we back? We're talking about mutual aid and all of the ways in which bridges have been built now that can be continued on into the future, and how we've broken down barriers. I think we're frozen, can you all see me? Oh, I have lost Mary. I'm not sure if people can see me on Facebook, but it looks like Mary's internet has gone out, or I've lost her in some way. So I want to say thank you again for Mary Arthur being here. And okay. and okay, I'll go ahead and wrap up. Some of my campaign team said, you know, it is frozen. I know you all can see me. Oh, I'm going to readmit um, Mary. Hi, Mary, you're back. We lost you for a minute, and I was about to wrap up. Um, okay. All right, Mary. I lost you for a minute.
My computer has this problem that it just kicks off periodically for no reason whatsoever.
That's
Very
it.
sorry.
And I'm sure our viewers can understand, you know, these technical glitches. You know, as your computer was shutting down, I was just talking about mutual aid and bridges that can be built.
Yes.
In addition to the ones that we're establishing and reestablishing right now and breaking down barriers, you know, we can continue that type of work as we're thinking about enriching and enhancing our urban canopy, and thinking about how do we share these resources and continue to share them far into the future. And that health isn't just this momentary getting through this challenge, but it's figuring out how do we use that resilience to continue all types of good work, right? But I was about to thank you, even though as your computer was shutting down, and I have so enjoyed this conversation, and you've given me a lot to think about. I was thinking about trees a lot before, and I'm sure that some of our people who have tuned in are also pretty aware of the benefits of trees, but you've shared so many resources with us and have given me a lot to consider about the importance of trees beyond what I even thought previously, and thinking about social justice and forestry as bound together. So thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just want to thank you for highlighting this issue in our town. I think it's a really important one. And like you said, it links together lots of different things. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you, Hannah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll share some of the resources that we talked about in the comments just in case. So, all right. So I'm going to